There were several points during World War I where the Germans weren't doing half bad. At the start, they almost took Paris, ending the war before it even properly began. When this failed, the Western front line stalemated, but the Germans arguably continued to dominate all other European front lines until 1917. Despite an extreme population and industrial overmight from the Entente to the Central Powers, and the Germans only having 3 allies, 2 of which were lacking at best, by 1917 the Germans managed to collapse the Russians. Would they now be able to follow this up by collapsing the French in the West? No, is the answer. Because for one, US forces were pouring into Europe. But besides that, the Central Powers were simply exhausted. Greece had joined the war, while the Entente broke through Ottoman lines. Soon, Bulgaria was the first to surrender, joined thereafter by the Ottomans. Nationalist revolts would tear down the Austrian Empire, and faced with losses from the Western Front and being surrounded by enemies, Germany too collapsed. The war was over. But today, we imagine a different scenario. What if everything went perfect for the Central Powers? We will try to imagine a world that results in the best outcome for Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottomans. And it's important that we focus on all 4, because this means that we cannot just have Germany overrun Paris, knock the French out of the war and end the war quickly. Such a war would just see Germany expand a little bit, but Europe would simply prepare for round 2. Germany and allies need to come out of World War I as the hegemons of Europe. So, to dive into the scenario, I want to restrict myself as much as possible in terms of the time frame, since the further back we start, the more opportunity we have to make it as easy as possible for the Germans to win. I want to keep it as much as our World War I as possible. But one change I do want to make is in the US election of 1912. Former President Roosevelt was squaring off against incumbent President Taft over who should get to represent the Republicans. The Republicans would choose Taft, causing Roosevelt to create his Bull Moose Progressive Party. This split in Republican voters allowed the Democratic Wilson to sweep the election. In fact, it didn't matter who the Democrats put up, they will win the election. And this brings us to the Democratic Convention of 1912, where the Democratic Party decided who would be their presidential candidate. Prominent nominations were Champ Clark and Woodrow Wilson. But there was a secret third candidate. This was William Bryan Jennings. He is the one that we want to win. He was a fierce non-interventionist, arguing against American involvement in Europe. Bryan had already been the Democratic candidate 3 times before, but instead of directly competing for the nomination, he had hoped that the convention would fail to choose between Clark and Wilson, picking him as a compromise candidate instead. This was a very dumb strategy. In this alternate timeline, we will have Bryan run and win the Democratic nomination, thus also becoming US President. With that, preparation time is already over. A certain Archduke is shot and the dominoes start falling, as war is now certain. But before we get how to I will let the Central Powers win, I want to debunk a common way others have done it. First, what if Germany simply fortifies the French border, focusing on beating Russia first? On paper, this is a great idea. Simply knocking out the Russians as fast as possible, then turning around and smashing the much weaker French. In the meantime, building Germany up for a much longer war due to Ukrainian resources. It's a great idea on paper, but it has a couple of issues. First, this strategy makes the Rhineland, the most industrial region of Germany, vulnerable to Western attacks should they manage to break through. At the same time, thanks to Germany's invasion of France, much of the industrial part of northern France was destroyed or occupied, weakening France in the process. In this alternate timeline, while Germany is dealing with Russia, France is free to try to break through in the West, while building up their own defenses. Even if Russia collapses, breaking through the much more fortified Belgium and France will be near impossible for Germany. Then finally, we are still in World War I. We cannot expect Germany to simply blitz through Russia. Russia is huge and underdeveloped in terms of infrastructure. In our timeline, with most of Germany's resources after 1914 tied up in Russia, it still took 3 years to knock out the giant. This strategy simply isn't going to work out for Germany, as some of you may expect. A related point is, what if Germany just doesn't invade Belgium? The argument here is that with Belgium independence respected, Britain will also stay neutral. Sadly, this also isn't true. When war broke out in Europe, the British cabinet had already decided that they were going to join the war. Perhaps it would be delayed by a little while, but there is no way that Britain ever allows Germany to dominate the other great powers of Europe without getting involved. Even if Germany doesn't invade Belgium, fortifies the West, and focuses on Russia, Britain is going to join the war and make things more difficult for Germany. Alright, so that's how we will not have the Central Powers win. So then what do we do? First off, we need to change Austria. They were simply unprepared for the war that was about to happen. When Franz Ferdinand was shot, Europe had quite some sympathy for the Austrians. But Austria did not quickly act against the Serbians. Instead, Austria deliberated, acted slowly, ensured German support, discussed some more, then sent an unacceptable ultimatum to Serbia, clearly designed to be a cause for war, which Serbia, in a surprise move, mostly accepted. And only then did Austria declare war, a full month after the actual death of Franz Ferdinand. Any sympathy the Austrians may have had long since disappeared by this point. To make matters worse, the Austrians were seemingly unaware of what kind of a war they were starting. While Russia, France and Germany were already mobilizing their entire armies, Austria still just called for a partial mobilization, believing the war to remain a regional affair. All of this was just an embarrassing diplomatic display from the Austrians, which we will need to change. Upon the death of Franz Ferdinand, we will have Austria act swiftly, declaring full mobilization and their intent to punish Serbia. Diplomacy collapses much quicker, and the world goes to war almost a month sooner. This benefits the Central Powers greatly, as Germany was way faster at mobilizing than Russia was, taking away valuable time of secret mobilization that the Russians used in our time. But we are not done with Austria yet, as they further misplayed the initial stages of the war. Expecting quick victory, they took an aggressive stance against Russia, only to have Russia counterattack and devastate Austrian lines, in a defeat Austria-Hungary wouldn't recover from for the rest of the war. Under German advisement, the Austrians instead take up defensive stances, while awaiting Germany's success on the Western Front. Germany would march their armies into Belgium as Britain enters the war. Due to the earlier war, the Germans have much more time to push in France. While, as discussed before, I will not have Germany capture Paris and end the war yet, there are still plenty of changes we can make here. First, the Germans need to learn some respect. Their conduct in Belgium and northern France was simply terrible, especially against the civilian population. If there was any doubt to the international community who the bad guys were, these actions certainly didn't help Germany's case. Across the war, over 20% of Belgium's population died, was deported or left. 20%. The Germans need to conduct themselves much more respectfully against especially the civilian populations of occupied regions. Then, after the Entente stabilized the front line around Paris, the remaining flatlands to the sea became the center of attention, as both sides attempted to fill up the remaining space. This race to the sea is where the extra time bought from less Russian mobilization will help out massively. We will have Germany refocused on the race to the sea earlier, while the Entente was still focused on Paris itself. This could allow us to have Germany achieve major successes, at best reaching the English Channel. This has two main advantages over our own timeline. First, the Germans can start pestering English shipping through the English Channel. And, unlike our timeline, where Belgium held on in Ypres, Belgium is fully taken. Both of these facts reduce Entente morale. By this point, it's time to look at the naval war. Fact is, the German Kriegsmarine, while powerful, cannot stand up to the British Royal Navy, and they shouldn't even try. At best, they should aim for operations in the Baltic Sea against the Russians. But while the Kriegsmarine is not doing so much, we will have the German High Command realize the power of the submarine. During World War I, submarines did a lot of damage to the British, especially in the later portions of the war. But the issue was, America and other neutral states were complaining. So, the Germans, periodically, toned down their submarine campaigns. This is why we wanted William Bryan to be president, as he would have a much weaker response to German actions. Despite any controversy, Germany mostly commits to their submarine warfare, building more submarines faster. By no means is this enough to destroy Britain, but it will absolutely help making them weaker and more willing to sign a peace deal later on. Alright, so with Bryan's in charge, the US will stay neutral for longer. But besides the US, there are a couple other important states to keep out of the war for as long as possible. Perhaps the most important of these was Italy. Whichever side they joined, it would cause a painful new front for the other side. Now there is one simple, yet humiliating way to keep Italy neutral for as long as possible. The Entente had offered Italy Tyrol, Istria and parts of Dalmatia if they joined the Entente. The only way to keep the Italians out is if Austria was willing to cede parts of their territory. This way, the Italians achieve most of their goals without having to risk a war. Especially with the better German performance, neutrality would be very appealing to Italy in this case. This would require extreme pressure from Germany, including promises of compensating Austria elsewhere once the war was won. But it is crucial in keeping the Italians out of the war. Slowly, Austria retreats and transfers territory over to Italy. Not everything yet though, to ensure Italy doesn't just take the free land and declare war on the Austrians anyway. By no means does this turn Italy into a Central Powers ally, but Italy will continue to bide their time, not picking either side yet, which is enough for now. Moving east, we have the Balkan. Once Bulgaria joins the war, the Central Powers will have no issue in running down Serbia, and Serbian forces leave into Greece and Albania. Soon, Albania too falls to Central Power forces. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so. Thank you. We now finally move over to the Russian front, where the Germans still achieve victories and the Russians retreat massively. From here, the eastern lines are temporarily locked in place as well. With the Austrians in a much better position and not having to worry about Italy in the south, holds the southern line much better. By the end of 1915, these are, roughly, the European front lines. By this point, the Ottomans had already joined the war, but it's difficult to think of what changes we could make. The Ottoman army and industry simply wasn't prepared for a sustained, total war. To make matters worse, the Ottomans were ruled by a clique of the Young Turks, who mishandled many aspects of the war while committing resources to horrific things like what they did to the Armenians. But in the small time frame we do have, there is simply nothing to change. In fact, the Young Turks were pretty much the only faction which wanted to join the Central Powers. When war broke out, most called for Ottoman neutrality. It is absolutely vital to have the Ottomans involved at all, as they did soak up millions of Entente soldiers. Militarily, the best we can do for the Ottomans is basically what they already did in our timeline. Threaten the Suez Canal by invading the Sinai, while trying to hold out as best they can against the Entente elsewhere, who are also invading through Persia. We will ensure that the Ottomans don't try to go on the offensive in the Caucasus at the start of the war, which frankly was a pretty insane idea. Apart from that, all the Ottomans need to do is sit there, not collapse, and soak up Entente soldiers until the Germans can win the war. This leads us to Asia, which, if we wanted to, we could simply ignore. For the Germans, it barely matters if they lose their Pacific holdings. So, if you believe that what I'm about to say is too unrealistic, simply ignore it. But Germany could try to get Japan on their side, or at least neutral. Both would be relatively minor changes, but would slightly help the Germans. So, when war breaks out, the Germans accept a Japanese demand to transfer Qingdao over to them while moving their fleets away from Asia. This wouldn't be a major loss to Germany, as Japan could have easily seized the town itself. But Germany goes further in communications with Japan, recognizing Japan's special interest over China, as well as the Russian Far East. The Germans also agree to hand over their Pacific holdings to Japan. All of this takes away any pretense for war that Japan has, allowing them to remain on the sidelines. This does, very much, require the Germans to swallow their pride and give in to the Japanese, which is a pretty unrealistic part, I will admit. Later, in 1916, when the war is still in Germany's favor, Japan may just join the Central Powers, focusing on defeating the Russians while attempting to not fight the British and the French as much as possible. With the Entente navies busy in Europe, they too don't have the resources to go fight the Japanese at all, and Asia just becomes a frozen front line. By this point, the war already massively favors the Germans, while, even under President Bryan's, the US is starting to consider intervention. This is still a long ways away. Right now, the Russians are starting to buckle under the pressure, while France and Britain fail to open up another front anywhere. As the Entente force Romania to join, the Central Powers overrun them as well. Unable to handle the pressure, in late 1916, a revolution occurs in Russia and the Tsar is deposed. In our timeline, the new Russian government made a frankly terrible decision, choosing to continue the war while it was already clear that Russia was not going to win it. This would lead to another revolution and the Bolsheviks seizing power. In this timeline, we will have the provisional government of Russia realize this fact. Russia simply cannot fight on, and peace negotiations begin. In our timeline, via the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the territory that Germany demanded was enormous. But the Germans only did this because the Bolsheviks, under advisement from Trotsky, decided to no longer fight the Germans, but also to not sign a peace deal. This idea went about as well as you'd expect, as the Germans, without any Bolshevik opposition, simply waltz into Russia. In this alternate timeline, Russia's negotiating position is much stronger. A Polish state is ripped away from Russia, a Lithuanian, Belarusian state would be carved out, Romania would be expanded, and a Western Ukrainian state may be created. The Ottomans push into the Caucasus, and finally, and perhaps most devastatingly, Japan seizes parts of the Far East before Japan drops out of the war. This peace deal is way more beneficial to Germany than the extreme demands they made in our timeline. Many of the conquered territories, but especially Ukraine, required millions of German soldiers to establish and keep control, while the Bolshevik Revolution would cause instability in the East. This alternate peace deal would strengthen the Central Powers while keeping a stable new regime in power in Russia. Sure, the territories gained are relatively small, but that also means that they are relatively easy to keep control over. Desperate to restore normalcy, trade between Germany and Russia could also very well pick up again, further easing German worries for starvation as Ukrainian grain still makes their way to Berlin. So now, the full force of Germany's armies bears down on the Western Front, not needing millions to garrison Ukraine and not really having to worry about American intervention. The Entente make a final, desperate plea to the Americans, but all President Bryan does is offer to mediate the peace deal. No help is coming, and while German progress is slow, Germany is definitely the one advancing. Seeing how the war is developing, Italy makes a bold decision. While they prefer the Entente over the Central Powers, joining the Central Powers now just makes more sense, as they are by far the favorites to win. Italian entry opens up another front line, and while they would soon get bogged down in the Alpine mountains, the shock of these extra fronts are not lost to the Entente. German submarines, as well as the Ottoman, Austrian and Italian navies, now secure the Mediterranean, and all hope for the Entente is pretty much lost. The British contact both Berlin and Washington, requesting to negotiate peace under American mediation. The Germans accept, and the peace to end the Great War gets discussed in a neutral location. Under American mediation, and due to the fact that the French and the British do still have fight in them, the peace deal is milder than Germany may have liked, but it would still secure German hegemony over Europe. First, any Central Power gains against Russia would be recognized. In Africa, the Germans gained the Congo, as well as French territories connecting it. Notice, the Germans don't take any British land. This they do intentionally. The Germans hope that after the war, Germany and Britain can end their rivalry. By taking territories from France, but not Britain, there is also the distinct hope that France feels betrayed, reducing the chance of another Franco-British alliance. Anyways, Italy also achieves minor colonial expansion, most notably by gaining Tunis from the French. In Asia, Germany returns to the colonial scene by seizing French Indochina, giving them a respectable Asian colony. This brings us to the Balkan. Bulgaria annexes a major chunk of Serbia, while also securing Dobruja from Romania. Austria annexes Montenegro's coastline, as well as a thin border strip from Serbia, which is planned to be depopulated and then resettled by Austrians and Hungarians. Italy gains southern Albania, and the remnants of the Balkan states become Austrian puppets. The Ottomans have gained parts of the Caucasus, but they fail to gain many further concessions. The British may give up Kuwait, and perhaps Cyprus if really necessary, but the Ottomans don't gain major prizes like Egypt or even just the Suez Canal. These are simply too important for Britain to give up, and Germany would never support the Ottomans in these gains. And, if I'm completely honest, that's a good thing for the Ottomans. Gaining millions more people who don't want to be a part of your empire, or the world's most important canal, would only paint a target on their back that they really don't need. Back to Europe, Poland loses a border strip to Germany while becoming an Austrian puppet. Germany would love to have Poland themselves, but this is the reward for Austria giving up territories to buy Italian neutrality. The other two states become ruled by German nobility as German puppets. Moving west, Germany seizes a lot of French territory, which includes some of France's most important coal and iron mines. Luxembourg is integrated into Germany, while Belgium loses a lot of territory as well. The rest of Belgium remains as a German puppet. Germany would request to expand Belgium along the French coast, but this is something Britain simply cannot accept. Finally, Italy expands into Corsica, Savoy and Nice. By the end of the war, this is the new map of Europe. And let's see the new world order. Germany has taken far less territory than they may have wanted, but this is honestly better for Germany. The way it stands, any trust between the former Entente is broken. The West may very well develop a myth that if only Russia didn't surrender, the war was winnable. Meanwhile, the Franco-British alliance is destroyed due to Britain barely losing anything, while France was mutilated. Then, with these borders, Russia and Germany don't need to be mortal enemies, something that wouldn't be true if Germany took the entire West. The same goes for Britain and Germany. Then, apart from the diplomatic benefits of this peace deal, Germany has a much better chance of securing permanent control over these gains than they would have if they had gained the entirety of the Brest-Litovsk borders. So, what happens next for Germany? Their eastern puppets become ruled by a German aristocracy, who rule over an agrarian population of serfs. Poland itself is interesting. A Habsburg is placed in charge, but Germany would push for shared influence over the nation. Over the next couple of decades, Austria and Germany could very likely wrestle over who gets to control the state. Over in the West, there is a reason that Germany has taken these territories. The Ardennes are now German, and the front line is just a very wide, flat land to Paris. But the German domination over France doesn't stop there. Before counting colonies and allies, Germany has more than 70 million people now. France has around 35 million. This is not to mention that Germany's population growth is much higher. Every single year, France gets less and less able to compete with Germany. Oh, yeah, and France has also settled with war reparations, further weakening the former superpower. Anyone who expects France to pull a Germany, start a new war, and surprise everyone by winning, I'm sorry, that's simply not happening. France's diplomatic situation too is horrible. The only hope they have is seeking out Britain and Russia again for a round 2. This is quite the unlikely prospect. Britain now will likely seek peace. The war was devastating, and unless Germany messes up so bad that everyone hates them, trying again with the same teams but weaker is just a recipe for disaster. While unhappy about Germany's hegemony in Europe, Britain is still the largest empire on Earth, and will now start focusing on themselves in a post-war world. The Americans see a minor economic collapse, having provided a lot of loans to the devastated Entente, but apart from that, they will open themselves up to trade with the Germans again. The post-war world will see the Americans remain isolationist, but still an economic hegemon, uninterested in pushing their influence elsewhere. In Asia, the Japanese have done tremendously, securing the Pacific and East Asia while grabbing influence in the fast collapsing China. After the war, Britain, Russia, Germany and Japan all start competing over influence in China, with Japan having secured a significant head start while Europe was fighting itself. This leads us to Russia, where it's tough to say what happens next, but I do have high hopes for the fragile republic to survive. Signing peace with Germany would have been a very popular move, and while the territory lost is a shame, Nicholas II is to blame, not the new government. Even with territory lost, Russia is the most populous European state, and they would try to continue their pre-World War I course, try to catch up to the rest of Europe, using their population advantage to push their might. Now the Ottomans have achieved victory, that is true, but their struggles are far from over. The Young Turks, now bolstered, start pushing their Turkification programs on the minorities of the empire. Especially the Christian minorities will be treated quite harshly, potentially even being deported or worse. Meanwhile, especially against the Arabs, the Young Turks attempt to create a pan-Ottoman identity. Would this be successful? It's difficult to say. But the Turks do have the salvation of oil. Very luckily, the Ottomans just so happen to have some of the most wealthy oil regions in the world, which could fuel the modernization the state so desperately needs. Then we have Bulgaria, which proportionally grew the most out of the entire conflict, grabbing pretty much every piece of territory they could have desired. Bulgaria, as a major power, now dictates Balkan policy. Whatever great powers the Bulgarians side with, that side will dominate the region. Bulgaria itself is also more stable than you may expect. Most of their territory is Bulgarian or Macedonian, while, should the Bulgarians choose, they can now take up the southern Slavic mantle from the Serbians. Bulgaria's future is exciting, as Kaiser Wilhelm lovingly dubbed them the Prussia of the Balkan. The Italians then now find themselves in solid control over the Mediterranean. Southern Albania and Naples ensures complete control over the Adriatic Sea. Control over Tunis and Sicily ensures that Italy can shut off any shipping from either side of the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, having expanded their border in both directions, and all of this while only joining the war at the final moment, means Italy is in an amazing position going forward, not having suffered the population or economic effects of 4 years of conflict. Our final nation then is Austria-Hungary. Their war gains are relatively minor, but that may just be a blessing. They really don't need more minorities and instability. But Austria's foreign position isn't that great. Italy still has desires on many territories they hold, and it's very much an open question if Austria and Bulgaria remain aligned. Their Balkan puppets will also do nothing but cause unrest, while Romania is itching for an opportunity to fight. The idea of an Italian-led anti-Austrian coalition isn't crazy. So, in terms of security, Austria-Hungary is still completely reliant on Germany. If Germany ever cuts their support for the Austrians are gone. Germany could very well pressure Austria over influence in Poland, further reducing Austrian relevance. Obviously, there is also the issue of the ethnic diversity of the empire. Both internally and externally, the Austrians are in a very tough position, and only time can tell if the empire, in its current form, can even continue. Now, I've been a bit vague in the conclusion to this video, But don't worry, next week I will release the continuation to this scenario. Does German hegemony last? Will the Austrians collapse under their own weight? Can Russia modernize and strike back? Does France ever become relevant again? Subscribe to find out next week. Unless this video is already old enough. Then just click the link on screen right now to watch the continuation. I thank you all for watching and I hope to see you there.